The envelope sat on the desk for 3 days before anyone touched it. That's what they said, anyway. The people who know these things, the ones who move quietly through carpeted corridors and say very little at dinner parties, they said the envelope sat there like something radioactive. Like if you got too close, it might rearrange your molecules. I heard this from a woman named Patricia. She works in administration. Has for 22 years. She doesn't gossip, that's the thing about Patricia. She observes. There's a difference, and she'll correct you if you confuse the two. It wasn't dramatic, she told me, pouring tea she'd already poured once and forgotten about. That's what people don't understand. The dramatic things never look dramatic when they're actually happening. They look like paperwork. It was a Tuesday in February when the mood shifted inside the palace. Not a full moon. Not a storm. Just a Tuesday, grey and damp the way London in February always is, the kind of cold that doesn't announce itself, just settles into your coat and stays there. The tourists outside the gates were the diehards. The ones with good camera equipment and zero interest in their own comfort. They stood with their thermos flasks and their long lenses, pointed at windows that gave away nothing. Inside, it was warm. It's always warm inside. Patricia had been refiling a set of documents, routine correspondence, nothing that would make headlines, when she heard it. Not an argument. Not raised voices. Something quieter and, worse than that. Silence in a place that should have been moving. She looked up. 2 senior aides were standing in the corridor outside the east-facing conference room. Standing very still. The kind of still that isn't calm, it's the still of 2 people who have just heard something and are deciding, separately, how to react to it. One of them, younger, newer, still had the slightly startled expression of someone who hadn't yet learned to arrange their face, looked like he'd swallowed something wrong. The other one just stared at the middle distance and breathed through his nose. Patricia went back to her documents. But she noted the time. 11:47 a.m. What was happening, though none of the people in those corridors could have described it in full at the time, was this: King Charles had made a decision. Not a public one. Not yet. But the kind of decision that exists fully formed before it's announced, before the press releases, before the briefings, before the carefully worded statements that say everything and nothing simultaneously. The decision was made. The machinery would follow. It concerned Edward and Sophie. The Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh, titles granted, settled, dignified. Most people had accepted the arrangement without particular comment. Edward had spent decades being the royal family member that tabloids couldn't quite get purchase on. Too quiet. Too earnest. Too genuinely invested in his Duke of Edinburgh charity work to generate the kind of friction that sells papers. Sophie had become something else entirely. Quietly essential. The kind of person the king trusted, which in that family, in that institution, means something very specific and very serious. The question of their titles, what they would carry forward, what they would pass down, what weight those names would eventually hold, had been circling for months. Possibly longer. These things always circle longer than anyone admits. But something had accelerated the timeline. And the something had a name. Andrew. Patricia didn't hear the name that Tuesday. She heard it 2 days later, from a colleague who'd overheard a phone call she definitely wasn't meant to overhear, in a hallway she was definitely meant to be walking through faster. Andrew in that building, at that moment in time, functioned less like a name and more like a weather system. You could feel it coming before it arrived. The air changed. People's eyes moved differently, not toward the thing, but carefully, deliberately away from it, the way you don't look directly at something that might look back. The situation with Andrew had been managed. That was the official internal position. Managed. Settled. Resolved. Except nothing with Andrew was ever fully resolved, was it? It sat there. In the background. Like a static charge. And every so often, something would disturb the air around it, and everyone would feel it in the fillings of their teeth. What had disturbed it this time, Patricia didn't know specifically, and she wouldn't speculate, because she observes, she doesn't speculate, was connected, somehow, to a request. Or a suggestion. Or something that had been floated in a conversation that should have remained private and didn't. Something about Royal Lodge. Something about a title. Something Andrew had said, or implied, or had someone say on his behalf. That was all she knew. That was enough. The tourists outside didn't know any of this, obviously. They stood at the gates with their thermoses and their cameras, and they photographed the guards and the stonework and each other, and they posted the photos, and the photos got small numbers of likes because February in London is grey and even the palace looks a bit defeated in February. One of them, a woman, maybe 60, American accent, the kind of person who reads historical fiction on long flights, had been standing at the gate for almost 40 minutes. Not photographing. Just looking. Her companion, a man who was presumably her husband, had given up 20 minutes earlier and gone to find coffee. She stayed. I noticed her because she wasn't holding anything up. No phone. No camera. Just standing there with her hands in her coat pockets, looking at the building the way you look at something you've thought about for a long time and are now trying to reconcile with the reality. I almost asked her what she was looking for. I didn't. Some questions are better left as questions. That evening, Patricia took her usual route home. 40-minute tube ride. She reads on the tube. Has done for years, always a novel, always a paperback, never her phone. That evening she didn't read. She sat with her book open on her lap and she stared at a fixed point somewhere above the head of a teenager who was asleep against the window, and she thought about the envelope. 3 days on a desk. The weight of a name. She thought about Edward, who had spent his whole adult life trying to be useful without being in the way, which is its own particular exhausting art form. She thought about Sophie, who had arrived into that family young and learned, the hard way, exactly what it cost to survive it with your actual personality intact. She thought about what a title means when it isn't just ceremonial. When it's protective. When it's the thing that defines what you owe and what you're owed and which room you're permitted to stand in when the conversations happen. The tube pulled into her station. She closed the book. It's never about the title, she said to no one in particular, gathering her bag. The teenager didn't wake up. The doors opened and she walked through them, and the train carried on without her, which is what trains do. Marcus had worked security detail for 11 years. He was not a talker. He would tell you that himself, and quickly, as though getting it out of the way so you couldn't expect anything from him afterward. He had a face built for neutrality, not blank, exactly, but composed. Like a man who had decided, at some point in his late 20s, that reactions were a luxury he couldn't afford professionally. He told me this story in a pub in Pimlico on a night when neither of us had planned to be there. One of those accidental conversations that starts because two people reach for the same barstool at the same moment and one of them says sorry and somehow that turns into an hour and a half and a second round neither of them planned. He didn't tell me his exact role. He was careful about that. He said security, which could mean 12 different things in that world, and I didn't push. What he told me was this. There's a moment, he said, that happens around significant internal decisions. Before any of it is public. Before the press office has drafted anything, before the leaks to the broadsheets, before the coordinated briefings. There's a shift in how people move through certain buildings. You can feel it, he said. The tempo changes. People who usually walk slowly start walking with purpose. People who usually look busy start looking very specifically at their phones. He wrapped both hands around his pint glass. And, then, there are the people who go very, very quiet. Those are the ones you watch. He'd noticed it in the week before the news about Edward and Sophie's titles began circulating in the more reliable corners of the media landscape. The quiet. The particular quality of it. Not the quiet of nothing happening. The quiet of something having already been decided. He'd been on a rotation near one of the side entrances that Thursday morning. Routine. He'd done it so many times he could have done it without thinking, which is why he noticed when something broke the pattern. A car he didn't recognize on the approved list pulled up. He was already moving before he consciously processed why. 11 years does that, builds a kind of muscle memory for wrong that bypasses the thinking part of your brain entirely. But the car was fine. The credentials were fine. The passenger was someone he recognized, an advisor, senior enough that Marcus knew the face but not the name, which was a very specific category of seniority in that world. What caught him was the expression. "Not worried," Marcus said carefully, searching for the right word the way you do when the right word is just slightly out of reach. Not worried. More like someone carrying something they didn't ask to carry and don't know how to put down. The advisor went inside. Marcus went back to his post. He thought about it for the rest of the shift. The thing about Andrew, and Marcus said this slowly, like he was testing the ice before he put his full weight on it, is that the institution has a protocol for almost everything. Abdications. Deaths. Divorces. Scandals. There are playbooks. Not literal ones, nothing so crude. But an institutional memory that knows, roughly, what to do when a thing goes wrong. The difficulty with Andrew's situation was that it kept being almost resolved and, then, not quite resolved, in a cycle that had been running for years. Every time the machinery thought it had processed the anomaly found a new shape. The titles questioned Edward and Sophie, what they carried, what it meant for the formal structure of the senior working royals had been genuinely complicated by whatever was occurring in parallel with Andrew's ongoing situation at Royal Lodge. Not directly connected, on paper. Deeply connected, in practice. Because in that family, at that institution, nothing is purely administrative. Everything is also symbolic. Every title granted or withheld is a statement about something else, about proximity to the center, about trust, about who is considered family and who is considered a problem wearing the costume of family. You can't draw the org chart without it being a values document at the same time, Marcus said. He didn't usually talk like that. I got the impression the thought had been forming for a while and this was the first time he'd had occasion to say it out loud. Sophie was the key, he thought. Not Edward. Sophie. Marcus had seen her 3 or 4 times in his 11 years, not up close, not in any situation requiring him to do anything except observe and be present. But you see things in that role that you wouldn't see from outside the gates. She's the one who understands how the room works, he said. You can tell, when she walks into a space, that she's already read it. Not calculating. Just aware. Like someone who grew up in a house where the furniture moved at night and learned very young to navigate in the dark. I didn't say anything. He took a long drink. The king trusts her. I mean actually trusts her. Which in that context is not a small thing. It's maybe the rarest thing. So the question of their titles wasn't separate from the question of Andrew. It was the answer to it. A decisive, formal, public answer that said, this is what the family is. This is who is inside it and, in what capacity. This is what we are willing to put our names on, literally, in ink, on official documents that will sit in archives for 200 years. Andrew's situation, the ambiguity of it, the ongoing low-grade institutional radiation of it, required a counterweight. Not a statement about Andrew. Something better than that. A statement about something else entirely. The pub was thinning out by then. A group near the door paid their bill and left in a blast of cold air. Someone put something on the jukebox that was too loud for the conversation we were having and we both waited it out without remarking on it. Did you ever hear what was in the envelope? I asked. I don't know why I thought he'd know about the envelope. I'd mentioned it earlier, the thing Patricia had told me, and I think I was grasping for a thread that would connect the two ends of the story. He looked at me. There are always envelopes, he said. That's not the point. The point is whether anyone opens them. He finished his drink. Someone opened this one. He put his glass down with the particular care of someone who doesn't like to make unnecessary noise, even with inanimate objects. That's all I know. And, honestly, a small pause, the half-smile of a man who measures his words the way a pharmacist measures doses, that's probably enough. Nadia had been covering the royal beat for 9 years. She would tell you, if you asked, that 9 years is long enough to develop a very specific kind of immunity to drama, the immunity of someone who has seen enough genuine, structural, historically significant drama that the manufactured kind stops registering. She would also tell you, if you kept asking, that she still got it wrong sometimes. The quiet ones catch you, she said. The ones that don't announce themselves. We met at a coffee shop near her office. She came in already moving, coat half off, phone in one hand, a look on her face that suggested she'd had 3 conversations before breakfast that would have exhausted most people for a full week. She sat down. She put the phone face down on the table. Deliberate act. Like setting something aside she'd need again soon but needed a few minutes away from. The Edward and Sophie thing, she said, was not what anyone was watching. That was the whole point. She had been, that particular month, spending the majority of her attention on the Andrew situation. Not unusually. Most people in her field were doing the same. It had a narrative gravity, the ongoing question of Royal Lodge, the question of security arrangements, the question of what exactly a prince with no public role and very substantial private complications is supposed to do, institutionally, year after year. It was the kind of story that always had another layer. Her source, she called this person a friend who has no official position, which is press speak for someone who has a very significant unofficial one, had called her on a Wednesday evening. She said something I'd been turning over ever since. The friend had said, "Stop looking at Andrew. Look at what's moving around Andrew." Like when you're trying to see a dim star, Nadia said. You don't look directly at it. You look slightly to the side, and your peripheral vision picks up what the center of your eye misses. What was moving around Andrew was this: the king had been, and Nadia was very precise about this word, deliberate. Not reactive. Not defensive. Not pulled into the undertow of each new development in his brother's situation and forced to respond to it. Deliberate. Choosing his terrain. Deciding what the story would be, instead of waiting to see what story would happen to him. The Edward and Sophie decision, the movement on their titles, the formal cementing of their position within the working royal structure, was part of that deliberateness. It said something about the institution without having to say anything about Andrew directly. It drew a line, not aggressively, not publicly, not in a way that invited Andrew to respond or the media to construct a conflict, but a line nonetheless. Here is what the family is. Here is who is trusted with its formal weight. Here is the shape of things going forward. It was a complete sentence, Nadia said. A grammatically complete sentence. Subject, verb, object. Done. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. The subject wasn't Andrew. But he was the reason the sentence got written. She had been outside that morning, the morning the news started filtering out through the usual channels, the careful drip of information that in that world passes for spontaneous disclosure. Not outside the palace. Outside the courthouse where she'd been covering something unrelated, entirely different case, different world. But she'd had her earpiece in and her phone in her hand and she'd heard the first notification come through and she'd stopped walking. Just stopped. On the pavement. Someone behind her nearly walked into her. "Sorry," she'd said, to the person she'd almost caused to stumble. "Sorry, but the person was already past her and gone." She stood there for a moment with London moving around her the way London always moves, continuous, indifferent, absolutely convinced that whatever you're experiencing is probably less urgent than it feels. She thought about Sophie. Specifically, she thought about a moment she'd observed, not during a formal engagement, not at an official event, but at something smaller, more peripheral, one of those occasions where the cameras are technically present but no one is expecting anything significant to happen and so everyone is slightly less performed than usual. Sophie had been talking to an elderly man. A veteran, Nadia thought, though she couldn't now remember the specifics of the event. He was small and slightly bent and wearing medals that looked too heavy for him, and Sophie had actually crouched, in formal clothes, without any apparent concern for how this looked, to be at eye level with him. And she had listened to him the way very few people listen to anyone anymore. Not waiting for the next thing to say. Just receiving what he was giving her. That's who they're formalizing, Nadia said. That's who gets a title that means something. Not because she was born to it. Because she earned the right to carry it. There was a boy outside the coffee shop window. Maybe 12. School uniform, backpack, eating a bag of crisps with the specific commitment of someone who has decided this was the most important thing happening in the world. He glanced up at the palace, which was visible at an angle from where we were sitting, and, then, he looked back at his crisps. Nadia noticed me noticing him. That's the thing, she said. For most people, for that kid, it's wallpaper. It's always been there and it'll always be there, and the question of what it means, who's inside it, what they're deciding. She made a gesture that encompassed the building, the institution, the 9 years she'd spent trying to describe both of them accurately, its background noise. Until it isn't, I said. She pointed at me. Until it isn't. Until something shifts, and, suddenly, the wallpaper is load-bearing, and everyone who ignored it starts paying very close attention. She picked up her phone. Turned it face up. 3 notifications waiting. This is one of those shifts, she said. She was already reading, already moving, already in the next part of the story. The king knows exactly what he's doing. That's what makes it interesting. He's not managing a crisis. She stood up, coat going back on in a single practiced motion. He's shaping the narrative. Quietly. Decisively. Before the crisis has a chance to become the story. She was already heading for the door. Andrew's the fire, she said, not turning around. Edward and Sophie are the firebreak. The door swung shut behind her. The boy outside finished his crisps. He folded the bag into a small precise square, the habit of someone who'd been told to do this enough times that it was automatic now, and he pushed it into his blazer pocket and walked on. The palace sat at the end of the street, gray and vast and absolutely still. Inside it, someone was opening an envelope. Or closing one. Or sitting with a decision that had already been made, feeling the specific weight of what it means to act quietly when the situation demands noise, and to choose, deliberately, the harder and more dignified thing. The king had made his move. London moved around it, indifferent the way it always is, and the morning continued, and the names would carry forward now into whatever came next. Some things are decided in rooms you'll never see. You only feel them afterward, when the air changes and you can't quite say why.